Hi, welcome everyone to the Global Reading Network's webinar today called Assessing Oral Language Reading, Comprehension, and Spelling Skills, Complements to the Early Grade Reading Assessment. My name is Allison Flepson. I'm the Reading Program Specialist here at Reading Within Reach, which supports the Global Reading Network. We're broadcasting this webinar to you today from Washington, D.C., and we thank all of you for joining us from wherever you are and whatever time zone you're in. We appreciate all of the participation and the discussion and conversations that many of these webinars have sparked. We're very happy today to have two presenters from RTI International to talk to you about some recent research that they've been doing to investigate new ways of measuring children's reading skills. They will be telling you about pilot work that they've done and how those results can be applied to the work that many people are doing around the world to improve early grade literacy. I'm just going to take a few minutes to introduce them in case you are not familiar with their work and have their bios in front of you. Dr. Peggy Dubeck is a senior literacy researcher for RTI International. Her interest in literacy work began when she was examining dyslexic readers learning in multilingual contexts. Since then, her experience has spanned the entire research cycle, including randomized controlled trials, pilots, and large-scale program implementation, evaluation, analysis, and dissemination. To date, she has provided technical support for USAID-funded literacy improvement efforts in 15 countries. In addition to this work, she's taught in diverse educational settings from kindergarten through the graduate level. She currently teaches graduate courses at the University of Virginia, where she obtained her PhD in reading education. Her colleague, Jonathan Stern, who will be presenting as well, is a senior research evaluation specialist at RTI. In this role, Dr. Stern's main responsibilities include designing research and evaluation plans, creating and validating assessments, and conducting training on data collection. Since joining RTI, Jonathan has provided technical expertise in more than a dozen countries, with extensive work in Cambodia, Ethiopia, Ghana, Jordan, and Tanzania. His most recent work has focused on developing and validating the Group-Administered Literacy Assessment, or GALA. Dr. Stern received his PhD in International Education Policy and Management from Vanderbilt University. So we welcome our presenters. The URC office is having some kind of a fire drill, apparently, so we are going to be turning our sound off on our end and turning it over to Dr. Dubeck and Dr. Stern to take forward. Please put your questions into the Q&A box of the on your WebEx interface there, because we will be monitoring that throughout the presentation and responding to questions both written and then following the presentation. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our presenters, and we will be online as well answering questions or chats you have. Thank you.
The agenda here in front of you is pretty straightforward. We are just going to go over a little bit of background on reading comprehension in general, as well as how we came about this work. We'll look a little bit at the approach that we took to piloting these subtasks, and there are 4 subtasks specifically that we'll be talking about today. You can see them listed there on the slide. We'll briefly go over some results and recommendations and then open it up for discussion as well. And at the bottom of that slide, you'll see that there's a link for the full report, as well as the subtasks that were piloted, so anyone who's interested in more information can find it there.
Okay, so right here on your screen you have 3 words, and I want you to read those 3 words to yourself. Read them out loud to yourself. So most likely you probably said something along the lines of pay dopo lagi, or maybe you said pay dopo lagi. And that's the beginning of accurate word identification and decoding. But you don't know what I don't think you know what you read. Next, click. So that sentence translates into we ask questions. So at the first line, you had decoding, but you didn't have comprehension until I developed your oral language. So click again. So now you have another sentence here, and based on your familiarity with now the orthography and the syntax of this language, you might be able to have a guess of what you think the second sentence is. So I want you to think about to yourself what you think that second sentence might be. So have a click again. And most likely you said something along the lines of we and questions because the sentence structure was the same, but with the middle vocabulary word being different. And so you can see there how oral language is actually a really crucial part. And it's, next slide, please. And it's something that's part of what is called the simple view of reading. And I've seen a lot of you present on this in the last couple of years, and there's also been talk about the not so simple view of reading. But just for keeping it simple, this is a really nice way of thinking about the fact that reading comprehension, the ultimate goal of reading, is the product of decoding times language comprehension, times language. And what happens is when, just like any kind of math problem, when one side of that equation is missing, then the product is 0. So decoding, if you can think of decoding times 1 and language times 1, that equals comprehension. And if one of those two sides of the equation is missing, you have no comprehension. So if language is missing, it's no comprehension. If decoding is missing, that's no comprehension. And we feel as though that the early grade reading assessment sometimes does a really nice job of assessing decoding, and some of its needs are developing a need for assessing language and assessing comprehension. So next slide, please. So this is a slide that I've used a lot over the last few years in some of the presentations I've given. This comes from the RAND study report that was chaired by Catherine Snow. And this is a slide that I could spend a couple of hours on, and I just am showing it today because what I like about what the RAND study group did is they're showing the complexity of trying to measure comprehension, and that all of those colors that are listed there, motivation, linguistic knowledge, vocabulary, background knowledge, strategy knowledge, and cognitive capacities, essentially all of those are contributing to reading comprehension. And really, to be accurately and reliably measuring comprehension, you should be measuring all of those. And that's, quite frankly, that's not just a fault of EGRA, that is something that all comprehension, reading comprehension tests have a challenge measuring. So measuring reading comprehension it's a complex construct, so it's a complex thing to try to measure. And so one of the things that we'll be talking about is ways to sort of minimize some of the constructs that you're getting, just at trying to get at removing some of these, but also still measuring comprehension. So the next slide. I've long been an advocate of thinking about spelling and how the strong relationship between word level spelling and word recognition. And because they're both using some of the same relationships between letters and sounds, and the structure of both the meaning, the morphology, the spelling, and the sounds of words have been shown to contribute to spelling across a lot of languages. And so we're going to be talking a little bit today about how we could think about using spelling within the early grade reading assessment. Next slide. So we're going to click through about 6 clicks to show how spelling is, it starts off with a very simple, when children, some of you might have seen this kind of writing, you can keep clicking through all of those. Some of you might have seen how children, when they're first learning to spell, they start off by doing scribbles. But very soon, when they're learning the relationship between sounds and letters, they start to represent the salient sounds of words. So the word rabbit, the sound you hear that's salient is the B. And a child who writes a RT or a B for rabbit is much further along than a child who just spells it with a letter M. And you can obviously see that there's quite a difference there between the child who just spells the beginning and the ending sound and actually represents both of the syllables. But this is one thing that we want to try to capture a little bit with the early grade reading assessment. So now let's look at something, click on the right side of the screen. And right now there's a dictation task within the early grade reading assessment that essentially captures information like this, where you have a a circle. It's representing correct answers and incorrect answers. And so it's binary. And so you can show that that navy blue section, if it's navy blue on your screen, that those are the children who got the word correct. And then the rest of the children are lumped together in the red, and those are all the incorrect. But within that red is a lot of variation to sort of to be similar to the way that those letters and are representing the word rabbit on the right. So click again, please. And so now we have another pie chart, and we still have the same proportion of children getting the word completely correct in the navy blue, the 4 out of 4. But now you can see where that red section, the red proportion where the children get the word wrong, there's variation in the types of answers they get. There's some children who got 3 out of the 4 parts of the word right, 2 out of 4, 1 out of 4. So those children are doing something a little bit more correct than the child who does 0 out of 4. So this is what we're trying to think about a little bit with, is there a way for us to try to move beyond binary spelling within the early grade reading assessment? So to the next slide. So here we have a few questions, and so here we're seeing some questions here, and unfortunately we don't have a chance to hear each of your responses, but we'd really like to think about from your perspective. You've used a lot of the early grade reading assessments, or maybe you haven't, because maybe you find some fault with it. So do you think the existing EGRA subtasks adequately measure comprehension, written spelling, and oral language? So I know we have well over 100 people on the line, so we're not going to be able to respond to them all, but we are monitoring the Q&A. So if we'd love to hear what you're saying about this, about do you think the EGRA subtasks adequately measure comprehension, written spelling, or oral language? Yeah, so we're hearing that Richard's saying yes, comprehension is doing a good job with literal. Written he's confirming what I had already said, it's doing the binary, and then oral language is limited. Sharon is saying we're testing comprehension with but oral language and spelling not so much. Great. So, and feel free to keep sending those in. We're not going to have all the solutions for you today, but what we're going to now do is present to you some of the methodology that we use to try to get at these 3 constructs, comprehension, written spelling, and oral language.
Yeah, so I think that, I mean, as you can see from those who did respond, there's sort of a mixed bag in what EGRA does and doesn't actually provide us in terms of those 3 ideas for comprehension, written spelling, and oral language. And I think that's pretty well known and regularly discussed for those who have any involvement with EGRA, that it has some strengths, but it has some limitations as well. And that was really what led Peggy and I to do this work in the first place, was trying to think of what are some potential complements to existing EGRA subtasks that could actually be used either as potential replacements or at least complementary. And Peggy will get to those research questions in just a moment. But really quickly in terms of our approach, so we actually had a few different subtasks, the 4 that we'll go over in a minute, but there's a sentence reading, a word reading, a spelling task, and a semantic fluency task. And we showed up in Accra and met with a local research team who's very experienced with EGRA, which was good to have a team that was very familiar with both the background of and administering EGRA. And so we showed up with a basic revised subtasks that we wanted to try and test out, but spent a few days with the team just making sure that they made sense contextually. And we actually spent about the first week or week and a half there going into schools nearly every day with really small samples of kids to just try out what it was that we were interested in. So both in terms of testing procedure and in terms of specific items. So each day we would show up in a school and anywhere from typically 10 to 20 kids, test some things out, come back at the end of the day, revise, make some adjustments, go back the next day and do the same. And then after about 2 weeks, we actually had our final pilot with just over 150 second graders in public schools in Accra who were in Twi-speaking schools where they also teach English. So we did create assessments in both English and Twi, but in the end, the results here that we will be presenting are focused specifically on English, partially because Twi did not work out as well as we had hoped, although there's no real reason from a linguistic standpoint why the subtask wouldn't have worked. We attribute it more to the fact that our initial intention was to revise and adapt both subtasks during our time there. We spent almost all of our time on English, and the Twi administration actually happened after we had left, and I think that it just needed some more revision before it would have been in the same place that the English one was. We also piloted some existing EGRA subtasks along with the new ones so that we could test for concurrent validity and see, the correlations between our new tasks and existing EGRA subtasks. We did some basic test-retest as well to get a sense of the consistency across administrations for our new tasks. It says here that we collected data using Tangerine. That's kind of half true. We'll talk about the administration in a little bit. It was a paper-based administration. We then entered the data into tablets using Tangerine afterward, and then analyzed the data using Stata. So that's a kind of quick overview of our general process, and Peggy will now take you into the specifics of the research questions themselves.
So our primary research question is that we feel that we've been really challenged by the early grade reading assessment, and how, even though, as some of you noted, it does measure reading comprehension, we felt as though it's a little bit challenging because of how it's attached to the length of the passage that a child reads. So we wanted to, and we also were challenged by sometimes some of the quality of the questions and the level of background knowledge that you can have to develop those questions. So we wanted to look at an individual word choice subtask and a sentence reading subtask to see if they could be used to either complement or to replace a reading comprehension passage. And then we wanted to look at a methodology for scoring spelling to see if it could give us some differentiated data beyond the binary correct and incorrect. And as we have seen in so many languages, does it still continue to show a relationship into decoding? Because if it does, then we would feel like we have a pretty good measure. And then because we were, as Jonathan mentioned, in and out of schools a lot, we were very interested in the validity and the reliability of the subtask that we designed. So we were really interested in the procedures, we were very interested in the directions, we were very interested in the construct, and were we capturing what we hoped to capture. And then also, because of going back to the simple view of reading, of having that language comprehension subtask, this element of the pilot was sort of added on. I don't want to say late, but it wasn't our original purpose. Our original purpose was to get at reading comprehension and spelling. So we wanted to know, we knew going into it, is there potential for this? And so we wanted to see, could you do it reliably and efficiently? And those of you that have measured oral language know that it's a challenging construct to measure in even the best of circumstances. So this was sort of a proof of concept of, could this be used in such a place. So to the next slide, please. So this slide here is just showing a group of children in a school in Accra, and this is one of our assessors, and the children are sitting at a table, and this is I think we ended up recommending that we do about 6 children at a time, and as Jonathan mentioned, it was a paper, children were answering the questions on paper, and then later the responses were entered into Tangerine. And Jonathan will talk a little bit about just trying to control wandering eyes of the children. Even though we were piloting and with first and then ultimately with a large group of second graders, kids at that age were, definitely still interested in what their neighbor had to have on their paper. So Jonathan will talk a little bit about how we had to control for that. But essentially what we liked about this was that you could get quite a lot of information by having multiple children working together at once. Next slide.
Yeah, so just quickly, I was going to flip to the next slide and then back to this one for a moment, but I might as well stay on this for a second while we have a picture of the kids with their forms. So for each of the subtasks, which we'll discuss in the next couple slides now, we actually created multiple forms of the assessment. So, for example, the little boy on the left would have Form A, the girl next to him Form B, and then the next boy Form A again, and alternating as such, where all of the response options or all of the items on the test were the same but in a different order. And since it was a self-directed assessment, there was guidance by the administrator and there was examples by the administrator, but students were then given a certain amount of time to complete each subtask. The order of the items didn't actually matter in terms of administration, but being able to provide students with answer keys or with test forms that had different orders allowed them to therefore, if they looked at their neighbor and said, oh, my neighbor said that the first one is correct, and then I write correct, they would actually be incorrect because they have a different question at the beginning. So even though the administrator had pretty good control with only 6 students at a time, that was just one little thing that we did to reduce the likelihood of copying correctly. As far as the subtasks themselves, we had a sentence reading task, and this is intended to measure sentence level comprehension. The way it's designed is that some sentences are clearly true while others are clearly not. Sentences are relatively simplistic, 3 to 5 words, and typically describe either a description of an item or object or the purpose of it. So if you look at that little example that's in red there, right, the false sentence might be ball is a color. A correct sentence would be red is a color. And we did actually pair up all sentences differing only by 1 word. So there were 20 items in total, but there were really 10 paired sentences. And as we said, so for example, the pair here is ball and red, both of which the sentence would be is a color. And when we went through the scoring, which we'll talk about in a little bit as well, we did it partially so we could see how many got each individual sentence correct versus what is the ability of students to get the pair correct, and how much did that impact how we wanted to score or analyze the data. There were 20 sentences in total, and a child had to tick if it was true or not true. We gave 5 minutes as a broad time for these, although often time was able to be stopped early because everyone had completed the task, but we wanted to ensure enough time for everyone to complete it. This slide shows the very top of the assessment form. So first, the assessor would do an example. You can actually very faintly behind our assessor in this picture see the little check mark and the X mark, and it says goats live in the sky and cats have tails. It's a little hard to read that, but each assessor would write the examples on the board. The examples were also at the top of the student sheets, and they would mark together whether a sentence was true or false to ensure that everyone both had a sense of what the check mark versus the X mark meant, as well as ensuring that they understood what the task was asking. So we wanted to make sure to provide a couple examples for them to do. And then there would just be a list of 20 sentences. Those are the first two that appear there. The dogs lay eggs and chickens have pencils. The intention was for both of these sentences to be marked as false, although I'm sure that there has been a time when a chicken has stolen a pencil from someone. But the main idea behind these is things that are typically obviously true or false. The corollaries for each of these, which appeared later down in the list, were birds lay eggs and chickens have feathers. So as we said, in each sentence, only one word was changed to make it false or true. A similar subtask was the word choice. So this is now, instead of sentence level comprehension, this is now word level comprehension. Instead of true, false, this is actually real and not real or nonsense words. We struggled mightily with the administration of this, and a lot of it was trying to get children to fully understand what we were asking. So we tried, is the word real or not real? Is it correct or incorrect? Is it a word you know or you don't know? It was very difficult to get students to really understand what we were looking for. And one of the things that our local team told us that they think caused some problems is that there was someone giving them a list of words. And so if we look, for example, here, in the example words, it was zam and sit, right? So zam should be a word that no one knows because it is not a real word, whereas sit is. However, you can already sort of see the complication when thinking about this in terms of, well, if you ask it as I know it or I don't know it, what exactly does that mean? Or if you ask it as, is this a word or is this not a word? We had our team told us that a lot of the students would actually just assume that any word you give them is a real word, and that there'd be no reason that you'd be trying to trick them by giving them a fake word, which is why we ultimately settled on the I know this word and I don't know this word. But even still, we often found that students, as they're sounding something out, it might sound very close to a word that they know, so they still say that they know it, even though it's not actually a word. So despite our best intentions, as you'll see when we get later into the results, the way that we designed and administered the subtask, it just didn't hold up as we had hoped. It turned out that it was right around 50% correct on this subtask across the board, which is exactly what the guessing parameter would be, right? So if everything can either be true or false, you would expect kids to get 50% just on chance alone. And so the fact that across our sample, we were still getting kids right around that 50% mark, there was no way to distinguish it from the guessing parameter. So we ultimately decided that this one wasn't gonna work for our purposes, but it was worth trying out, and there's still possibilities that there would be a way to revise it so that it would be viable, but we didn't find it during our time.
Okay, so now I'm going to just talk a little bit about dictation or individual word spelling. And as I mentioned earlier, this was adapted from a curriculum-based measure, which is used in some classrooms to just be monitoring children's growth in a skill. And so we adapted this from Wright's work. And for both TWE and English, we used common orthographic patterns that represent early words used in first, second, third grade reading and writing, and that represent the phonology. The reason why we went with the curriculum-based measure methodology is it doesn't require extensive linguistic knowledge of the language. And some of you have seen me present in the past about spelling when we talk about minimal pairs, if a child confuses a T with a D or a P with a B, sounds that are one's a voice sound and one's an unvoiced sound. That would be a really interesting way to get some great information on children's spelling, but we wanted to come up with a methodology that didn't require having to have that extensive knowledge of what sounds might be confused. So we were introduced to this curriculum-based measure by Marcia Davison, so many of you know her, and she had success with this in the past and suggested that we try it. And so we did, and so I'd like to just tell you a little bit about it. So it was an oral task, and we had to think about, the amount of time. We're always thinking about subject effects, and we don't want kids to get too tired. So, similar to the other two tasks, these were done in a group format, and we were trying to minimize the use of sentences, which maybe going forward we might use sentences, but we wanted to just have words that could be understood in isolation without having to have a sentence. And that does actually add some complications because you have to avoid minimal pairs. As on the slide there, we have words like, we have the words sing and sink. And without a sentence, those are hard to hear, that ending. And we had the same things happening in TWE. So I still would recommend that you stay away from the sentence because children do tend to sometimes spell a word that's in the sentence as opposed to the word that's the target word. But it does create some complications. But the really nice thing about the task is the ease in which it's scored. And what you're doing is you're scoring the word for the correct letter sequencing, and you're starting at the beginning of the word and going through the end of the word. And so there's always a place to show that you know that the order of the letters is correct. So the example word that we are showing towards the bottom of the slide is the word talk. Now, it's a 4-letter word, and it's scored for 5 different spaces. And so the sequence 1 is a space before the letter T, meaning did the child represent the word talk by the very first letter being a T with nothing preceding it. And then the child is given credit for doing T followed by A, and then A followed by L, L followed by K, and then at the end of the word, K followed by a space. So the words will all have the spacing at the beginning and the end, so there's always going to be one more item than there are letters in a word. And so these are the same procedures that we use for the TWE words. And so we, again, going back to my idea, ideally, I'd also be, possibly scoring this with a little bit more linguistic information for children who confuse a T with a D or a K with a G, but we didn't do that. And that's, I think, beyond what we can be doing right now. And but we feel pretty good about this methodology. We tried it out, and it was working really well in the pilot. And so we in the little field test, and then it worked out really well in the pilot. So to the next slide, please. So semantic fluency was something that we added in to try to capture children's expressive language skills. And again, this was an adaptation from other existing measures. Semantic fluency has actually quite an extensive research base. It's been used for children in classrooms, but it's also been used for people who've had injuries, brain injuries, it's also used in speech and language situations. So there's quite a lot of variations that are out there, and so we looked at several options and then refined them either further. And what's happening in this task is the child is speaking and given 60 seconds to it's funny, my expressive language right now is a little bit thwarted, to give words related to a particular category. And so the child's given a category and told to say as many words as they can for that category. When we developed it, and during our field testing, we ultimately came up with 2 categories that we'd like to share with you. One was called a limitless category, where within 60 seconds, a child or anybody could probably continue to go on and just say a limitless number of items related to that category. Animals was a category where children could just, they could pull from lots of domains of animals. And a constrained category was one that doesn't have as many possibilities. So colors was a category where children might have 10 or 15 items, but it's not going to go into the hundreds of items. We had to be thinking about language interference, and this is in the situations where EGRA is used. There'll be a lot of situations where children are they're not sure if the word is a word in English, or if that's a word that's a TWE word, or if that's a word in another language. So we had to pay a lot of attention to that and identifying the categories. We had to consider phrases and how if a child says a phrase instead of an individual word, that impacts the scores. We had to think quite a lot about priming and what was available in the classroom. Some of the classrooms that we visited were quite print rich, and so if you're saying to a child, name all the body parts that you can, and there's a poster of a body part behind the child, that's obviously going to prime them for answers. So we had to remove things from the walls. And then this was usually the last task that we gave. The other tasks that were given in the group format, and then this task would be something that would be done at the end. The assessor is writing down what the child says, and then the responses are categorized. And we were able to get people to be very reliable on what the child wrote, but then categorizing it did take a little bit of time, so we came up with this acronym called LORU, which you can read a little bit more about that in the report. We'd be happy to answer questions, but about how to categorize items, words that were repeated or something said from another language. So next slide. So I know you're by yourself in your offices somewhere, or you're in your houses, or maybe you're under a tree, but I do just want you to role play this. I'm just going to I have my timer here. So I'm the assessor and you're the child, and no one's gonna have to say anything out loud because I won't be able to hear you, but I am gonna read these directions to you, and then you're gonna do this task. So I like animals. We're going to talk about animals. I want you to say as many animals in English as you can until I say stop. You can say any type of animal in English, and I'll write what you say. Do you understand? Start. Okay, your time is up. I do wish we were all together in a room, because I'd love to hear you let out a big sigh and giggle a little bit and just give your comments on this. But we would like to hear your comments about this, particularly when we get to the Q&A in a little bit. But that helps you maybe to give an understanding of how the task went.
So we're now going to talk briefly about the results. As I mentioned earlier, the results that we'll be discussing will focus specifically on English. And we'll go through them relatively quickly, as we're down to about 15 minutes left, and we want to ensure that people have time for any questions and discussion toward the end. But so if there's anything that I gloss over too quickly, please feel free to toss a question into the Q&A, but I'll try and at least give the high-level important results. So first, just most broadly looking at the mean scores, this just kind of gives us a basic sense of what we found in a very broad way. So the semantic fluency task, which Peggy just had you all do, not surprisingly, the any category task had slightly more words per minute than the constrained task. However, it was interesting to note that there were a number of kids in that any category or the open response one who really struggled to get started. In some ways, even though you may have a constrained task, so there are only so many animals or colors, for example, that you might be able to name. The open category, having anything at all, a lot of kids just really didn't know where to begin, and then they would sort of latch on to something. So typically they would tend toward a category. So maybe they would just notice something around the room and start saying like desk, foot, pencil, chair, assessor, tablet. But it was interesting to note that there was ultimately little to no difference between the two categories. For sentence choice, not surprisingly, when done as individual sentences, so out of the 20, students were able to get about 65% correct, which is higher than the paired sentences, so only 44% of the paired sentences correct, which is what we'd expect, that it would be a little bit more difficult to get the pair than the independent ones. And ultimately, that's what we went with for most of our scoring, was the paired, because it was a better reduction on guessing, as we mentioned earlier. So if you're just looking at the individual sentences, you have a 50% chance of guessing correctly. If you're looking at pairs, you're now down to a 25% chance. And it held up relatively well across the different ways that we analyzed it. For dictation, you see that on average, kids got about 25% of the words correct in dictation, but nearly half of the letters correct. So this goes back to what Peggy was saying earlier about what you're missing when looking at just the words as an entire word correct. You're actually missing out on a fair amount of more nuanced information about how they're starting to spell along the way. And Peggy will talk more about this in a couple slides. And then the last three are just measures on the EGRA subtask. It's a relatively high-performing group. We had very few 0 scores on oral reading fluency. We had about 30 words per minute overall. We also found that those students who did well on the sentence choice tended to also do quite well on oral reading fluency. When we look at the correlations themselves, we see, not surprisingly, some of the EGRA subtasks are very highly correlated with one another, as has been shown many times before. The word dictation task was also quite highly correlated with all of the EGRA subtasks. The sentence choice below what we would maybe consider the traditional conventional cutoff of 0.7, but still a moderately strong correlation between sentence choice and comprehension. One thing that I found interesting when looking at these data is, so reading comprehension and the oral reading, you can see, I was just trying to put the cursor over it. Reading comprehension and oral reading you see is a 0.85 correlation. A lot of times there are concerns about the fact that that's at least slightly by design, because the further you read in a passage, the more questions you get asked. So if you actually look at the correlation between oral reading and reading comprehension of the questions attempted, so you don't look at it overall, but you look at that relationship, it turns out that it's 0.68, which is exactly the same as the relationship between oral reading and sentence choice. So in terms of the, when you take out that constraint in the EGRA, the relationship between sentence choice and reading comprehension to oral reading score is identical, which I just found interesting in its own right. Semantic fluency was clearly the lowest correlation of all. And we didn't really have strong expectations as to what exactly that would be correlated with. But the other tasks, the dictation and the sentence choice, presented some promising results. And sentence choice also had a test-retest measure of about 0.76, not quite as high as you would want it to be, as a test-retest was actually done in the same day, but not bad, but not great. And the overall test scale, when looking at it, the Cronbach's alpha, when looking at all the subtasks combined, it's about 0.92, which is very good. When taking out reading comprehension, so for example, if you just had sentence choice and not the reading comprehension, it was still about 0.90, so not much of a reduction in the test scale by removing the reading comprehension measure. So that's a lot of small numbers on the screen and other ones that I'm just randomly spouting out at you, but hopefully it gives a little bit of sense about some of the promising results in terms of the relationships. And Peggy will now talk for a moment on the dictation.
Yeah, so earlier in the presentation, I showed you the pie chart that was just a hypothetical pie chart of trying to show the binary versus doing qualitative scoring. And this is not a pie chart, obviously, it's just a table. But what you can see in the top table is that 70% of the students were able to correctly write the first letter of a word. And when you go to the next row, and 53% of the children were able to write the final letter of the word. And just thinking about the way English languages establishing that salient sound, it is usually the first sound that's a little bit more salient, and so this kind of corresponds with what we do see in early spelling and early dictation abilities. Down at the bottom table, what I'm showing here is the middle column that says 0 words spelled correctly, and the far right column that says at least 1 word spelled correctly. These are comparing groups of children. So children who were unable to spell any words correctly at all, none of all the 12 words that they attempted, they didn't spell any of them correctly. They were still able to do, 34% of them were able to do the first letter of that word, and of those 0 words correct, 17% were able to get the last letter of some words spelled correctly. So this, if you think back to that word rabbit that we had, this is showing children who are maybe able to spell rabbit with an R or a T or an R. And so this is doing what we want it to do. It's capturing those very early spelling skills that ultimately you ultimately want the children to be able to spell the word correctly, but being able to represent parts of the word is a stage or a phase that most of us go through when we're first learning to represent a language in writing. So the next slide, please. So if you haven't already picked up my bias while we've been talking, I am biased. I am biased towards spelling, and I am biased towards trying to get good information that's useful and reliable. So we have some recommendations that we'd like to present now, and there's more details for all these recommendations in the report that Jonathan referenced in the first or second slide. So let's go on to the recommendations. So our first research question was, could a word choice subtask or a sentence choice subtask be used to replace or to complement the reading comprehension measure? And for word choice, we don't recommend that for use in lower primary. As Jonathan really explained quite nicely, is we were just having a lot of trouble getting children to even understand the task. So we don't recommend that for the early grades. It wasn't measuring the construct we intended, but I've used this with older children, grades 5, grade 6, grade 8, and I do think older children do understand this task. But for the sentence choice, we do recommend this for the lower primary. As Jonathan already described, it has a strong relationship to the existing reading comprehension subtasks, and it was stable at a couple of time points. And so that was getting to our third research question of can some of these measures be given reliably and give us valid information? So for dictation, the red box, I definitely recommend it. I really think spelling is really important to kind of capture that early representation of what children know about the written word. And, you know, it's a much better way to capture spelling abilities than the binary correct or incorrect. And we didn't show you a distribution, but we could have. But it does provide a distribution of abilities, and it can be scored quite reliably. So we feel very good about that task, and we definitely recommend it. So for semantic fluency, we loved it in terms of people liked it and the kids liked it. It seemed kind of, you know, it was a stress reliever. They weren't using a pencil or a pen. But it needs to be piloted further with some additional language measures to see, are we pulling from the actual construct of oral language? So yes, so it needs some promise. So to the next slide. And so some of our references, there's our contacts, and now we have just a few minutes left for discussion. It's still a written discussion, but we'd love those of you that are sending us questions in the Q&A in the written form. We'd love to keep this discussion going, if you have any of you used any of these subtasks or something similar? You know, as Jonathan mentioned earlier, we were interested in these because we felt that the early grade reading assessment was needing something like this. And why are your reasons? And then maybe do you have any other recommendations for the global reading community? We've had over 125 people on this call, so we know we have a lot of people out there doing some really awesome things related to capturing what children are doing for their early reading development. So please send us your questions or your comments.